now 41-year career are disembodied but hovering in the earth plane for one of two reasons. One, they have drug and alcohol addiction. They need a body in order to have the feeling of satiation, so they possess people. The other is entities that died in circumstances that left them with the very strong urge for revenge. And it's very, very common for people that have a possession to find themselves all of a sudden with unusual urges, such as to drink, to smoke, to drug. Some people are possessed enough that they're not noticing it. They just act it out. So one of the tips is that...
Paul Chek, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
What is an entity, and what is an entity extraction?
Essentially, an entity is a conscious agent within you that is not you. It's something, conscious entity that is other than yourself. And most of what people think are entities are actually not entities. They're what Jung called complexes. A complex in Jungian psychology is a network of emotionally charged neurons that connect by association and develop an autonomous personality in and of themselves. So eventually they begin to be so charged and so heavily connected throughout the nervous system and brain that they take on an autonomic personality, which leads to what is called multiple personality disorder. Many people have some variation of that. It could be borderline personality disorder or multiple personality disorder. Jung, in his work, identified people that he worked with that had as many as 100 different personalities in them. I've worked with many, many people with these kinds of challenges. Now, in Native American Indian philosophy, what causes these complex often leads to what is called soul loss. So the trauma of an event, for example, a child being traumatized by the parents or sexually abused or any kind of abuse that's enough that the child feels so threatened that the conscious sense of itself tries to escape the body, can lead to soul loss. So if that aspect of the consciousness of the child, for example, if a child is sexually abused, it's very normal for the soul to retract itself from the pelvic girdle, and it'll sit outside the body. The challenge is whenever we have soul loss, that fraction of the soul stops its psychological development at point of trauma. So many of what people think are entities are actually the fragments of the soul, and those aspects of the soul now become like watchdogs. So they're constantly surveying the environment, looking for any linkages and associations to the trauma. For example, if you were traumatized by your father and he has dark hair and he was wearing a white shirt and blue jeans with a black belt, now anytime that soul fragment sees a male, that will set off a charge. If he's got dark hair, it sets off another charge. If he's wearing a white shirt, black belt, and blue jeans, it amplifies the charge. And that part of the soul will try to get the awareness of its own soul construct and let it know that it's in the presence of danger. And so typically what you see is a lot of anxiety in people whenever any aspect of the soul that's fragmented begins to perceive that there's a threat in the environment. And because so many people have a lot of these unresolved complexes or soul loss in Native American philosophy, I've worked with people that had 32 fragments to their soul, and it took me sometimes 3 years to reintegrate them for them. Identifying them is easy, but it takes a fair bit of work for the client or patient to do the integration work, because the trauma is actually often so strong that that aspect of the psyche wants to stay outside and watch to protect it, because it is stuck in time, so it can't see how the individual has moved on or maybe even healed the relationship with their abusive parent. So it still is stuck in that time. And so part of bringing the fragment back in is to make it aware that, you know, maybe you've healed, or that you've now got freedom in your life, or that you've got joy in your life. And so you actually have to develop a relationship with these soul fragments and parent them back into you, which is more than I can explain on a podcast of the techniques that I use. So that's one thing that commonly gets misinterpreted as an entity, because the characteristics, how a person behaves when they have soul loss like that, is very similar to how they behave when they have an entity possession, because as far as the ego is concerned, there is a voice inside of it. There's an autonomous agency inside of it that is other than itself. So people can actually talk to a therapist like me and describe what sounds fairly identical to entity possession. One of the distinguishing ways to know that you have an entity is, first and foremost, when we get possessed by an entity, which is a disembodied soul. Almost all the entities I've run into in my now 41-year career and working with this stuff a lot are disembodied but hovering in the earth plane for one of two reasons. The two most common reasons that entities stay in the earth plane and possess people is, one, they have drug and alcohol addiction, and without a body, they can't satiate that. The desire stays in the astral body, but the physical body is where they have the feeling of the fulfillment of the heroin, the alcohol, the cocaine, or whatever it might be. So the desire to fulfill that need or way of medicating oneself is so strong that even when they drop the body, they need a body in order to have the feeling of satiation. So they possess people. And it's very, very common for people that have a possession to find themselves all of a sudden with unusual urges, such as to drink, to smoke, to drug, and various things like that. So one of the tips is that once the entity's in you, your normal way of relating to substances and food and various other things takes a shift that other people around you see as uncharacteristic for you. And some people notice it, but some people are possessed enough that they're not noticing it. They just act it out. The other is that entities that died in circumstances that left them with the very strong urge for revenge will often try to possess people as a means of using that body and mind to enact some kind of retribution for how they were killed. And those people that get possessed by those types of entities often start having very dark thoughts and violent thoughts and the desire to kill people. And so it can be very disconcerting and confusing for them. One of the other ways that I've found very consistently to tell if someone's got an entity possession is, for some reason, the entity cannot take over both eyes. So often when I'm working with people that have a possession, when I'm talking to them, one eye will be focusing on me and the other eye will be looking off, oftentimes looking around the room. It's as though there's two people in the body and one eye is under control of each of them, the one that lives in the body and the one that's possessing the body. So some people aren't aware enough of what they're looking at to see it. They might just think that this person's got weird eyes. But I've seen this in many, many cases. And then once the entity is extracted, they now have access to both of their eyes. So there's often very unusual shifts in behavior, like someone that normally went to bed at 10 o'clock at night all of a sudden wants to stay up, watch TV, and be up all night, and it causes them a lot of trouble because maybe they got to get up at 6 in the morning every day to go to work. They often have problems managing relationships where they didn't have those types of problems before. Pretty much everything and anything that was normal and characteristic of them, from the things they read to the things they like to eat to entertainment that they like, can all change quite quickly. It may be one or two or three or a whole radical change. And often family members or people close to them realize something's very different here. And I've seen many, many people get entity possessions in group ceremonies with ayahuasca and any of the plant medicines, because once you take a psychedelic drug into your body, research shows, and I've seen the research, and they've measured this a variety of different ways, but what they do is they monitor the energy field of the body, and they find that as the drug comes on, the chakras open and the energy field expands. So the layers of your aura expand, which means you're open. So if you're with somebody, for example, that you're really in love with, your aura and your chakras will open to receive them. If you're with someone that is threatening to you, your energy field will collapse and create like a energy shirt, a protective barrier, and your chakras will close down. And the research shows that on average, it takes 2 weeks for your energy field to reach the point where you can regulate it normally. And therefore, there's a 2-week period beginning from the moment the drugs come on for the following 2 weeks where a person cannot regulate their own energy field, and that makes you permeable to entities. They can walk right into you. And so I've had quite a number of people go through the kinds of symptoms and changes I've just described, who heard about me or listened to my podcast or knew people that knew me and had to come to me for entity extractions. And I've had cases with multiple entities in them that came into them in an ayahuasca ceremony or a mushroom ceremony or things like that. And very few people that run these things know how to clear the space and create a sacred space and a protective space, nor clear the individual, nor what to do with them when they have these problems. So unfortunately, this is going wild all over the world right now.
On what plane of reality do entities exist? Are there entities in the room with me right now, but my body is not perceptible to them? Do I have some type of immunity if I am embodied or in a certain type of resonance? Are they always there? Like, where do entities exist? Are they contagious or can I make out with a girl or a guy and be permeable? And
entities are always trying to trade up. Just like you want the most beautiful, probably most intelligent woman you can find as a man, unless you're the average man, then you want a beautiful, stupid woman you can control. But I'm married to 2 beautiful, highly intelligent women because I'm here to get a job done in the world and I need people to support me. So I went for the most beautiful and most intelligent woman Great Spirit could support me with, and I hit the jackpot twice, fortunately. The key thing is that to the degree one does not fully inhabit their body, like I said, if someone's sexually abused, they often disembody their pelvic girdle. If people are heartbroken, they will also extract themselves from their heart. When people, for example, women that don't like their breasts will extract their soul from their chest because they actually have a negative, often even hateful relationship with a body part. So whenever someone's not fully inhabited, that part of their body is open to any entity that wants to enter it. And in my third eye, when I look at people like that, they often have black holes in their energy field, or it looks like if you've ever seen a mirror that's been punched or hit and the glass fractures and pieces of it fall out and you see the black of the mirror where the glass is gone. So often after psychedelic journeys where people have been taken too deep and it scares them so bad it literally has a fracturing effect on the psyche, I can see holes on the energy field that are black, so they draw in light instead of pushing the light of that spirit out. So anytime that a person for any reason is not fully inhabiting their body, they're leaving themselves wide open to an entity that wants to possess them. Most of the entities are in the astral dimension, because when your physical body dies, you instantly are in the astral dimension. And so there's a whole process that goes on in the astral dimension. But one of the most common things you hear in near-death experiences is that people will go through a process, but then there will be a very powerful light that appears, which is often said to be the light of God, but and I believe that's what it is. And so, but if a person, for example, has a fearful relationship with God, which is one of the things that I find very disdaining about the Abrahamic religions, especially, is they all create this fear of a God that'll punish you and burn you in hell. So if a soul, for any reason, feels guilty, shameful, or is in a state of self-judgment for anything that it's done in its life and can't face God, then a lot of those entities will not enter the light, so they can hover in the astral plane for very, very long periods of time. I've run into many of them and helped many of them transition in my work. There's a very good podcast, by the way, on my podcast with a psychic medium named Sally Crow, who's famous for working with people in the afterlife, and my wife, Angie Chek, who's an expert at that. And I think it's called Life Beyond Death with Angie Chek and Sally Crow, Salicro. So there's a couple of hours of deep exploration by the three of us into our own experiences and what we do. But the answer is that most entities are in the astral dimension. Now, the astral dimension is not somewhere out there. The astral dimension is a much higher vibrational dimension that penetrates this dimension. So just like right now in the room you're sitting in, there's television waves, radio waves, microwaves for cell phones, and a myriad of other frequencies that are just above or below your sensory perception. The astral dimension interpenetrates the physical dimension like water is penetrated by wet, metaphorically. You can't separate water and wet. You can't separate the physical and the astral. And you can't separate the physical and the astral from the mental, because they're like higher vibrational entities condensing down into the lower dimension. So whenever God dreams itself into existence, consciousness condenses itself into form. This is why Cheng Tzu says emptiness is form and form is emptiness, because all form emerges from emptiness and ultimately returns back to emptiness. So there's a condensation of consciousness in these higher vibrational dimensions, which is what your chakras do, is connect to different levels of vibrational reality, dimensional reality. The lower three are in the physical. Then the heart integrates the upper three. And so the fifth, sixth, and seventh are very much in the astral and the mental and the higher mental dimensions. And those are the layers of a human energy field which are interpenetrating the body. So the entities are typically in the astral dimension, because if they move on to the mental dimension, then they're in the realm of archetypes. And so that's not a place where the person is so embodied that it's caught in urges and trauma from life. You actually have to go through a death process in the astral dimension as well, unless you move into the light and then you go through another process. So the answer is there's entities that can be all around you. It depends where you're at. For example, if you go to a bar where there's a lot of bikers, there's usually tons of entities there. Wherever there's people that are doing drugs, acting violently, or are very traumatized, such as villages of people living on the street, groups where people practice Satanism, wherever there's people that are holding on to a lot of unresolved pain, judgment, and bias, and who are not inhabiting their body and not keeping their bodies healthy, entities hover in those areas because those are the people they can easily get a hold of. It's very hard for an entity to penetrate the energy field because the entity's in the astral dimension, and your energy field creates a vibrational wall. And the person that fully inhabits themselves glows like a sun. So as metaphor, if you tried to get too close to the sun, it would incinerate your physical body, and you would be found in your astral body, which is not sensitive to the heat of the sun. As a remote viewer, I've been to the sun many times. I've been all over the universe, but I travel in my astral body, which is I call my spirit body. So I don't have to deal with the physical body, but the entities themselves, being in the astral body, want to get into a physical body so that they can inhabit the sensory systems and have the feelings of being embodied, whether it be to get sex, whatever they're addicted to. Typically could be sex, could be drugs, could be power. So when you ask the question, are they all around you? It depends where you're at. This is why, for example, by law, if you go to sell a house that somebody's died in, you have to report it. It's illegal to sell a house that somebody died in without reporting it. Why? Because one, children, especially up until about 5 or 6 years of age, are very conscious in the astral dimension, and they haven't fully inhabited their bodies yet. So what most people refer to as ghosts, they see just like I'm looking at you right now, and it can be very scary for them. And so there's also a lot more people that are sensitive to people in the astral dimension than the public is consciously aware of, because it's kind of a social taboo to talk about those things, unfortunately. It didn't used to be, but it is now. You can thank the Christian church for a lot of that. You can thank scientific materialism for a lot of that. So what I'm saying is, if you're in a space that is inhabited by people that put off a vibration that is more oriented toward love and connection, and not separation and lack or fear or judgment, if you're in an environment that creates more of a supportive environment for integration of the whole being, there's really nothing there for entities to sustain themselves. But as soon as you get people that are doing dangerous drugs, that are oriented toward emotions of anger, violence, hate, resent, revenge, the entities feed off of that, because like attracts like. So entities that left the world in a state of anger, vengeance, or addiction are only able to effectively come into resonance with people that have the same resonant vibrations, and the other ones have too much light and too much coherence for them to enter. So it would be for them like you trying to walk through a wall. But if someone's vacated themselves or is living in such a way that they're not coherent as a person, then it would be like you leaving the front door of your house open all night and wondering where your furniture went when you wake up in the morning, because you invite criminals into your house by not creating a safe container for yourself.
Are entities souls with unfinished business in a way, like on this plane of reality? If someone, is it come from a previously embodied human, and when they pass, they kind of don't have proper passage? Is that what an entity is?
Well, an entity can be a human, and most of them are, but they can also be non-human. You can have entities that come from areas of negative energy in the earth. You can have entities that are animals. These are less common than human possessions, but I've seen people possessed by very strange things that were even shocking for me to find. But you also have entity possession. Another version that's very common is through what are called egregores, or thought forms. And an egregore, for example, any thought produces an image in the astral dimension. So I'll give you a case history. I once had a woman come to me who was emotionally very distraught. She was in her 30s, and she was referred to me by her boyfriend, who is a Chek practitioner, who felt, for all the reasons I've outlined, that she might be possessed. And her behavior could be very erratic and unusual, and all of a sudden she would turn and act in ways that were completely uncharacteristic to the way she typically was in the relationship. And it could happen unexpectedly, and it often happened if they were having any kind of disagreements over things. And so I worked with her and I analyzed her, and I identified that she indeed did have an entity possession. But I found something very strange and unusual in her, which I have seen since, but she was the first one that I actually saw this, and this was probably 20 years ago. And so because I'm clairvoyant, I can look inside of people, and what I saw was, one was like a little toy donkey, but it was animated. Another one was like a teddy bear, and the other one was some other little creature that looked like something kids would play with, but these things were animated and they were talking to her and they were constantly trying to get her attention. And so when I investigated her childhood, I wanted to see what happened in the period of her childhood, because these were children's toys that were now animated. And so it turns out that she was from Australia and she lived a long ways out in the countryside, and both of her parents were medical doctors, and she was Iranian and her parents were Iranian, and they were immigrants. And apparently that was the only place they could afford to live, and both parents had to drive, I think, an hour or more into the town near them where they worked as doctors, but they couldn't afford a babysitter. So from the time she was about 5, if I remember right, she had to spend the whole day at home alone. And she was so isolated and alone that he began to dream up imaginary partners, and her child mind dreamed up these little characters, one that looked like a horse or a donkey, another one that looked like a doll, and another one, I can't remember what it looked like, but it was clearly an astral entity. And so when I was doing the entity work with her and looking inside of her, I explained to her what I was seeing, and she looked shocked. And she got quite emotional, and she started to cry. And I said, "What are you experiencing right now?" She goes, "It's been so long since this happened in my life, but you've just made me realize what it is that's inside of me." She said, "When my parents used to leave and leave me at home alone, I was so alone that I dreamed up exactly the beings that you've just described, and they were my friends, and I would play with them all day because I had nobody else to play with." And so what happened is she had dreamed these thought forms up, and she'd poured so much of her emotion and her psyche into them that she actually, you could say, ensouled these astral beings with a projection of her own psyche. But they had begun to feel alone and isolated and frustrated that they couldn't get her attention anymore. So they had reached point of such emotional charge that were coupled with the complexes in her own psyche from the trauma of being alone, that they were now acting negatively to try to get her attention. They were essentially throwing what would be like a temper tantrum that a child would throw, but inside of her. And so whenever she would get into a situation that would trigger off emotion, like an argument with her boyfriend, for example, or feeling fearful that she wouldn't make enough money this month, or any number of triggers, these entities would react inside of her, and her personality would change and her behavior would change. And so I extracted those entities from her, but told her that she would need to consciously connect to them and let them know that she was safe now, and that they would be safe if they just went back to the astral dimension, and that she couldn't hold them in her energy field any longer. So she had to go through a period of integration work where she learned to disconnect from these entities, but be consciously aware when they were starting to be active in her, so she knew to direct her attention inward to them, or they would literally take over her psyche. So for all intents and purposes, she behaved just like somebody that had a human entity possession, but it was actually what is classically called an egregore, which is a thought form entity possession. So there's also lots of people with those out there. And a simple example of how many there are: anybody in any religion that worships any deity, for example, Jesus, nobody's ever met Jesus. Jesus is a mythological story that people convince themselves to be real. But because there's, approximately 1.2 billion people in the world, who have their own idea of who and what Jesus is, sum total of all that emotion and all that thought directed toward Jesus produces an egregore. called Jesus, which contains not only the positive thoughts, feelings, and emotions, but every negative thought, feeling, emotion toward Jesus or anything done in the name of Jesus. And countless millions, if not billions, of people have died at the hands of Christians who are wiping other cultures out and even killing each other. There's 45,000 branches of Christianity, each claiming to have the authentic teachings of Jesus. So there's tremendous infighting within Christianity all about Jesus and what Jesus wants or what God wants. So all these entities are actually egregores that are all under the umbrella of the thought form of Jesus. So you now have a thought form that acts through the psyche of all the people that believe in Jesus and carries with it this tremendous polarity from onward Christian soldiers marching off to war with the cross of Jesus going on before, which is sung in Christian churches all the time, which is completely and utterly antagonistic to who Jesus was meant to really be, to this unconditionally loving being called Jesus. And so this entity or this egregore actually possesses people and resonates with them at the level of their own psychic development and their own level of awareness. So the negative aspects of Jesus are used to justify negative acts towards other people by Christians in the name of Jesus, yet those that are, we could say, have evolved to the point of trying to live as unconditionally loving as possible, resonate with the aspects of the egregore that tune to that frequency, which is sympathetic resonance. So you have an egregore for every sports team. You have an egregore for every company. You have an egregore for every governmental group. Wherever people get together with a common identifier, dream, goal, intention, an egregore is created out of those. And those things are very, very powerful and very real. There's a great book called Egregores. I think it's by Wasserman. And it's very thorough and it's very real. And it shows you how cults are largely governed by and controlled by the egregore of the cult, and why it is so hard to get people out of cults due to the egregore possession, and what has to be done to remove people from cults, which is probably a lot more than we want to get into right now. But when you actually understand thought form entities, they're all over the place. I used to make a habit of, because I spent 25 years traveling around the world lecturing, one of my hobbies was to go to churches or temples, mostly churches because there's so many more of them. And I would just stand next to the church and put my hands on the wall and turn on my clairvoyance and look and see what was in the astral dimension all around the church. And I could see all the thought forms and emotions, and I could tell just by standing there what the vibration of the collective of people in that church was, very easily, because I'm very sensitive to those vibrations. But I would actually be able to see all the thought forms hovering around in and around the church, because they float around kind of like, if you've ever seen balloons that got loose from a celebration, how they float up in the air, but they can only go so high. And they'll sit there, then as the helium gas breaks down, they'll start sinking down. So if you can imagine around a church, in what would look like your aura is all these thought forms moving in and out of the church, just like wind moves balloons around. And it's easy to tell what the resonant vibration of the people in the church is by what thought form entities are floating around the church.
How could a person tell if there was an entity living in their home? If they're a 45-year-old, a little bit more denser than like an ethereal, metaphysical, shamanic type being, plumber in Connecticut. How could a person, plumber in Connecticut, determine if there is some type of entity in their home? And would people in that home be susceptible to that entity jumping into people passing through that home?
Well, absolutely. Anytime there's an entity, a disembodied soul, I'm speaking of a human entity now, anybody that has any of the criteria that I've just mentioned to you previously is open to an entity no matter where they're at. That's just a fact. Some of the ways that a person could be aware there's an entity, and it depends on the energy of the entity, because entities are as varied as human beings are. So you've got, very unhealthy, very judgmental, angry human beings, and depressed human beings, and anxious human beings, all the way to very loving and very wholesome human beings. We have an entity that lives in our main house. Someone died in our main house. And in the previous house I lived in, that Penny and I bought and lived in for 13 years, they announced to us when we went to look at the house that the people that built it, it was either the mother or the father, the wife or the husband's father, that had died in the house. And within a day or two, Angie and I, and Penny, who's not clairvoyant and usually doesn't see these things, actually could see this entity and described him to me and Angie, and was exactly bang on. So it was kind of a shock for all of us, because it was the first time Penny actually saw an entity, because she's more of a left brain, logical, rational person. She's not really into a lot of metaphysical stuff. But he looked like this one, for example, he looked like a well-dressed man of about 75 to 78. And he looked like he was dressed for Sunday school. He wore really nice clothes and a hat. And for example, when Mana was about 3, I used to see him standing out in the garden having a full-blown conversation with someone, but he was looking up like he was looking at somebody, but in the physical world, there was nobody there. But in my inner vision, I could see he was talking to this man. And so once I saw the man was there, I went to him in my spirit body, and I said to him, you can stay here, but you must never hurt, confuse, or do anything negative to my family, my children, or anybody that ever visits here. And he told me with assurance that no, he just loved it here and didn't want to be anywhere else. And he asked if he could stay. And I said, sure. And in our big house here, there's also an entity that died in the house. But once a person dies, they don't have to maintain the age and the look that they're in. They often take the age and the look of their favorite time of life. So a lot of people, for example, that die in their 80s and 90s, if you see them in their astral body, they look like they're in their 20s or 30s. They look when they were at the peak of their life. That's very classic. The one I've seen in the house looks like a little girl. But the answer to your question is some of the ways you can tell. You could be, for example, sitting and maybe reading a book or watching TV and see something moving in your peripheral vision. Most of these things are picked up by our peripheral vision. The left brain is so linear oriented that if you're reading a book or watching TV, it's very engaged in that. So we can call it very one-dimensional in its perception. But the right brain seems to be much more capable of picking things up in the periphery. And so oftentimes people might be reading or washing the dishes and looking out the window, and all of a sudden feel somebody standing next to them. A lot of people don't have clairvoyance, but they feel something in the room. They feel just like the feeling of somebody staring at you, and you turn around and sure enough, someone's staring at you. So it can feel like there's a presence in the room. Depending on the energy level of the entity and other factors, you can often hear them moving in the house. Strangely enough, it'll sound like someone walking in the house, and you go looking to see if someone's there. There's nobody there. You can hear, sometimes you can hear things moving, like somebody moved a pot. Carl Jung describes how Carl Jung was going through a sort of a crisis period in his life, and he realized he needed to be more in touch with nature. So he built himself quite a large house out of stone right on the lake in Zurich, Switzerland. And he wanted to return as much to sort of natural living as he can. So he had no running water, no electricity. He did everything by hand. So, it was like, poop in a hole in the ground toilet. He had to cook with fire and wood and a stove. But he had a rack like you see in a lot of chefs' kitchens where he had beautiful, high-quality brass and other copper cast iron pots and pans. And he describes how the spirits of the house would try to get his attention if he wasn't connecting to them enough and putting enough of his love and attention into them, and that he could be sitting there having a conversation or reading, and all of a sudden the pots and pans would start clanking like wind chimes get banged together when wind blows, but there would be nobody there. So he would describe how the spirits in that house would make sure he knew that they were there, so he would direct his attention to them and connect to them. So depending on the type of entity, the intensity of its desires, its needs, many factors, you can either sense them in your peripheral vision, sense them by feeling, hear them, have strange sounds, even windows and doors closing that are out of characteristics for the environment, like no wind, but all of a sudden a window closes like a wind hit it. Sometimes you can feel what feels like a temperature shift in the house, often to colder. Fortunately for me, I can see them. I've talked to many of them over the years. Those are the main things. But one of the fastest ways to know you've got an entity in the house, two ways, is one, if you have kids that are less than 6 years old and haven't gone through too much trauma or indoctrination yet. Typically between 3 and 6, they're not fully integrated into their bodies yet. And so they're very alive in the astral dimension, and their right brain is very active. So they see them, and they will tell their parents that they see them, but the parents will, say, don't say stupid things like that, and talk them out of it. So the kids lose confidence in their inner vision. But the other thing is that cats and dogs are very sensitive of them because they can see into the astral dimension. And I'll give you an example of that. Many years ago, I was visiting our UK distributor for the Chek Institute, and she'd recently bought a new house with 3 levels, and she had a dog. And I had just arrived there. I'd only been there for about a day, and her upstairs was kind of her living room, and it had a lot of windows, and this is outside of London, in a small town outside of London. In those days, I was doing a tremendous amount of research. So when I wasn't teaching or working with clients, I spent most of my time studying. And I was up in her living room area, and all of a sudden, I felt something come into the house through the window, and I looked, and it was a cat. And her dog happened to be laying on the floor with me, just hanging out with me, and it started chasing the cat all over the place and barking at it and trying to catch it. And so I said to Alex, our distributor, I said, do you know that you have cat entity that lives here and hangs out here? She looked at me in shock. She said, oh my God. She goes, where did you see it? I said, well, it came right through the window and came out and was hanging out with me up in the reading area. And I saw it many, many times after that. I mean, consistently it was there. But the reason it was so shocking is she goes, Paul, the craziest thing is since I moved in this house, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 times a day, my dog will go batshit crazy and start running around the house like it's chasing something, and it's barking and barking, and it's just going wild. And I said, it's chasing this cat. So there you see that animals can see the entity. So when people have pets, especially cats or dogs, and all of a sudden they start behaving strangely, like they would if a stranger walked into the house, like barking at a wall or barking into what looks like nowhere, or a cat getting reactive and hissing, it's because they actually can't tell the difference between a physical person and a astral person, because they don't have any intellect to make the difference. And they will react to these astral beings exactly like they would react to a stranger walking into the living space.
I've had that experience with, I have a dog. And about maybe 4 months ago, we were out for a walk and we walked past this kind of old house. I think it was actually got converted into they sell plants or something there. And we were walking past the house and the sidewalk, and suddenly she became very alarmed about
Yeah.
whatever was down this driveway. And there was nothing. I'm looking for everything, and it was like she was looking very specifically at something that I
Yeah.
was not able to detect. I'm skeptical. So maybe she saw something, some whatever thing somewhere else in the distance. I'm still open to that, but I cannot detect what it was. And she was backing up from it, and then she'd go towards it, and then she'd get scared and back up from it. And every time we walked past that house, she would go on alert. We only walked back once again just to experiment. And then when I came back the next time we walked past it, she didn't have that same response. But it felt like she was seeing something, was my experience with it.
Could have been a dog or a cat that had died there at some point. Oftentimes the animals, and like I said, sometimes people, they don't want to be in a different environment. They feel at home there. So even when they lose their body, an animal has no sense of the difference between what we call life and death. In fact, an interesting little factoid for you is I was reading once about wartime research and all the research that the Germans did with, nasty stuff, experiments on human beings during war, and the Hitler's research projects were not very nice. But one of the things that Hitler did was his researchers, which I believe was the SS, trained German shepherds to speak German, and they were able to get them to where they could speak 400 words in German. They could understand them and communicate. So the dogs couldn't speak German, but they could understand it. But what they did was they developed a code, kind of like Morse code, so they could ask the dog a question and the dog could scratch a piece of wood. They would put a piece of wood on the ground like a scratch pad. And just like you have Morse code, they could ask the dog a question, and they trained it to speak back to them in this code, which would be translated into German. That's how they trained the dogs. And like I said, the dogs were able to handle about 400 words in German. And one of the questions they asked the dogs is, "Are you afraid of death?" And consistently, the dogs told them there is no such thing as death. So that was a very interesting thing that came out of that research that I thought was quite profound. Ibrahim Karim, the founder of Biogeometry, who's an extremely tapped-in human being, says that all animals essentially live in what we call our right brain, that they have very little to no left brain function at all. So there's no barrier between dimensions for them. In other words, a cat that's astral and a cat that's physical are just cats to them. So that's another way, is to watch the behavior of animals, particularly cats and dogs, because they both are very sensitive to astral entities and react to them just like they would, and human entities as well.
It doesn't surprise me that story comes to your mind, because I have a German Shepherd. So it doesn't surprise me that the story that pops into your mind is a story about German Shepherd, or that could be your go-to story. And
it just happens to be one that when I'm talking to people about what happens when you die, I cite that because it's actually a very interesting experiment, because most of us can't communicate with dogs at a rational level. We think we can, but research, for example, shows that the dogs don't actually remember the words we use. What they do is they lock on to inflections of our voice and our tone. In other words, if I've got two dogs, one's Teddy and one's Samson. When I say the word Teddy, Teddy does not hear Teddy. He hears the vibration, the inflections, and knows with intention that when I look at him and he hears that combination of, call it frequencies, that's his set of frequencies. He responds to that, but he doesn't in his mind think the word, oh, Teddy, that's my name. So I just thought it's always a very interesting thing to share with people that are afraid of death, because oftentimes people have more trust in what animals say than they do humans for good reasons.
If a person comes into contact for the first time that they're aware of with some type of entity in their lives, in their homes, in a hotel, and somewhere of the sort, what is the user manual on how to engage with this entity in the best way? What are the best practices?
The same thing you would do with another human being. If you walked into your house and there was a 75-year-old man sitting in your living room, wouldn't you first say, well, who are you and why are you here?
I would personally probably shit my pants and run out of the house.
Yeah, well,
I guess. Sorry.
It would depend. I mean, if you saw some buffed out prisoner with tattoos all over the place, then, I'm an ex-paratrooper and have a long background in martial arts, so I would probably behave a little differently. But my first question would be, why are you here? Don't you know this is not your house? It's my house or whatever. But the way to interact with them for those that can see them is simply to talk to them. When I do entity extractions, which I don't enjoy doing for a lot of reasons, I've done a lot of it, but I try not to send out to the world that I want to do that kind of work for reasons that I explain very thoroughly in that podcast and audio series with Kedrich Olson. Simply put, people that have a tendency to attract entities are very commonly people that are stuck in the child archetype, the victim archetype, the saboteur archetype, or the prostitute archetype, and don't really want to participate and take responsibility for their life. So over the years, I've had to do multiple extractions of entities on the same people because they keep continuing to stay addicted to drugs and violent behaviors and not taking responsibility for their own mind and their own life. And so I don't enjoy working with people that don't really want to heal. And when they come to me with entities, they say, look, this is a sign you really need to start taking responsibility for yourself, because if this is happening to you now, it means essentially you're getting worse, not better, because you're becoming a target for entities that know that you're easy to take over. And that makes your life more complicated, and it makes your relationships more complicated, etc. So having dealt with so many of these people, I saw there was a common gestalt at play. That doesn't mean that others don't get possessed. I've seen good people get possessed, which is very, and when I say good people, I mean people that shouldn't really be dealing with a possession based on everything I've shared here. But there can be things that happen. And so the good news is once you take an entity out of a person like that and identify any factor that they have, some factor in their life could be maybe they're going through a divorce and they're very angry. And so that's an unusual state for them. When I teach them what they need to do to protect themselves from entity possession, they'll do it, because it's usually very disconcerting to have an entity in you.
What would be, so if you experience, probably most people, I would presume, are not clairvoyant in that way, and they have different types of voyances. Maybe they feel, maybe they hear, maybe they, internal messages, something of the sorts, just like a kinesthetic type sensation. Maybe it's a temperature thing. But if it feels clear that there is something among them that is, not on this plane like human, what would be next best practices to follow?
Direct your attention to it and simply ask it, who are you or what are you and why are you here. The way you hear an entity, they speak telepathically. That someone in the astral dimension, you can look and see their mouth moving, but your physical ears don't hear it. So it would be clairaudience that you'd have to hear it in. To see it, you have to have some degree of clairvoyance. We all have voyances. It's just most people don't use them, so they atrophy. But the simple and criteria or prerequisite for communicating with an entity of any type is that once you state a question, you have to completely empty your own mind of your own thought. So if pretended you were an entity and I said, Aaron, this is me pretending you're an entity, who are you and why are you here? I wouldn't hear what I would hear right now on this podcast through my ears. I would have to ask the question, empty my thoughts, and what would show up next would be like listening to my own thoughts, but they would be actually you speaking to me. So I would actually hear your thoughts appear in my mind, just like if you think right now, I got to remember to go shopping tonight, you can hear your own thought in your head without your lips moving. We're all able to hear our own thoughts inside. So you simply have to listen inside of yourself. But what the part is that most people have a hard time with is their minds are so, like constantly bubbling with tons and tons of shoulds and shouldn'ts and fears and gotta do, can't do, blah, blah, blah. It's like there's just like a whole auditorium of talking heads in there. So they don't get still enough inside themselves to ever clear out the crosstalk, which is all their complexes talking to each other. But anybody that can calm their mind and listen, once you ask a question of an entity, you just simply listen deeply, and what you will hear sounds just like your own thoughts, but you will know it's not your own thoughts because A, you're not thinking it, and B, it'll be an answer to a question you've asked them.
What is the most common thread or theme of what an entity would respond with if you were to ask an entity in a home, why are you here?
It's almost always because they died there and they think it's their home and then you're in their home. And most of the time they love being there. Like the old man that I told you about in our Vista house, he just loved it there. It was a really beautiful property, orange trees, 3/4 of an acre. You could see the ocean from the front driveway. Just a really lovely place to live. And his son, I believe, or daughter, his son, I think it was his son that was the father. They raised all their kids there. They built the house themselves. They lived there for 35 years. He was a scientist and she was a professional woodworker, an award-winning woodworker. And the garage was a huge woodworking studio where she built tables and chairs and furniture for a living. And he came to live with them as he got to be too old to take care of himself, but he just loved it there and didn't want to leave. So typically that's what it is. If it's anything other than that, it's almost always because the entity has followed somebody home for all the reasons I mentioned before. It can also be that there is negative entities that are attracted to the house. For example, where I used to work was a beautiful 3,400 square foot house on top of a huge cliff that went down to a small lake. I called it the Heaven House because it was just stunningly beautiful, and the house was just really beautiful architecture. It was an octagonal house, high ceilings, marble floors, very special place. And all my clients, friends, everybody loved being there because it had gorgeous views and was just an awesome place. I forgot what I was going to tell you about that place. What was it that you were asking me about?
What is the most common question that they would ask or response to the question?
Oh, yes, thank you. So why I was mentioning that is that, I moved there to get away from people. It was it was 20-minute drive out into the middle of nowhere for me and barely could get internet connection out there, which made it really hard to do client coaching and things like podcasts. But that's why I wanted to be out there, because it was secluded. But I'd only been in there for 1 month. I came to work one day and the house was trashed. My computer was ripped off. My very expensive high-end Mac screen, big screen I use for, doing image work and stuff like that, was gone. The door had been kicked in. But interesting, when the sheriff came out to investigate, he informed me that that house used to have a meth lab in the garage, and that he had to come out there, multiple times in the past due to violence and other stuff like that. And now I had done a thorough clearing on the house and used a shamanic clearing and sage and everything else. And he suspected that the reason it got broke into is because people that knew there was a drug lab and there didn't realize they were gone, and they came into the house looking for drugs or to steal anything they could sell to get a drug fix. So the point I'm making is, if you're in a place where you've had a cult, or you've had a lot of drug use or drug manufacture or violence, or people practicing black arts, anything that creates a resonant field that's attractive to entities of that type can cause a possession of any kind of house or building.
How often would an entity that a person would come in contact with have malevolent intentions?
Well, it's hard for me to really answer that objectively, because most of the people that come to me because they're having a lot of problems with entities, and they were already having problems to begin with, which is what set them up for this. And so the people that come into contact with entities that are not negative don't come to people like me, because to them it's not scary. It's very interesting and fascinating. They often develop relationships with them and learn things from them. So you normally only hear about the negative ones. So I can't do justice, because I don't know what percentage of people that have contact with entities are having positive contact. I only know that the ones that come to me for help come because they're it's really turning their life upside down, causing a lot of trouble. But I would imagine it's probably like the Tai Chi symbol, fairly balanced between the yin and the yang of it all. It's just that we're more aware of the darker aspects of it, not positive aspects.
If there is an entity in someone's space and they do not want it to be there, whether the entity is benevolent or malevolent, how do you go about extracting an entity from your space?
Well, there's a lot of ways. Some of them take a lot more skill than others. One is you can just get everybody in the house together in a circle, hold hands, do a prayer, and first fill yourself with unconditional love, and then fill the house with unconditional love. Bring the vibration up as high as you can, and then direct your attention to the entity and say, thank you for leaving our sacred space. This is our home, and we need to have the sanctity of our own home, and we would like you to please move to the dimension which is your natural home at this time, not here. So oftentimes it just takes a prayer with clear intention, and also the intention to fill the space with your own love, harmony, and energy. Most entities have a hard time existing in high vibrational energies of love. That's one of the fastest ways to protect yourself, is just keep your heart open, try to live from your heart, because quite a lot of the positive entities would never do anything to infringe upon you. Just they'd be respectful, just like a human being would be respectful to you. Like someone coming to your door to sell you a vacuum is not going to sneak in the house, surprise you, and put you in a chokehold and say, buy this vacuum or else. So with negative entities, there's almost always, in all my experience, there's something that they want or need that they can't get, and they think that they can get it there. But almost always what it is that see, a lot of entities, because they don't have a biological system, they don't eat and breathe, and they don't create life force energy, which you have to do to keep your body alive. They actually have to feed off of people's emotions in order to get the same thing you would get from eating and drinking and what we would call acquired chi, technically. So negative entities, like places like biker bars and fights, and wherever people are doing alcohol and drugs and acting rowdy, because they go and actually feed off of those emotions, just like you drink water and eat food. So you won't get rid of negative entities in a house where there's a lot of attractive energy that feeds them and they resonate with it because they get excited and enthralled by it. So just the way people are often very attracted to violence, and we love boxing and kickboxing and murder mysteries, a lot of these entities are attracted to people that live in the way that they're accustomed to because they feed off of it. Again, like attracts like. That's the law of resonance.
What happens if a person, thank you for entertaining all these questions. I find this very interesting.
Not exactly what I thought you would be talking to me about.
What happens if a person responds with fear or terror?
It depends on the entity. If they're there because they want power over people, then that will just feed them and make them stronger. And it gives them that sense of entitlement and empowerment. When I'm doing entity extraction, I have to be very, fortunately, I have a background in, as a paratrooper in martial arts, and violence and fear and death are things I've confronted many times in my life. So I know how to stay centered in myself and not lose composure. There's a lot of things they do to you at the elite level of training as a soldier to teach you how to stay centered in yourself in extreme situations. Otherwise, you could start killing your own fellow soldiers, not realizing what you're doing. So I have to really stay very centered in myself and very clear, but because I understand who and what they are, I am very direct with them and say, ask them, what is it that you want? Why are you here? And you don't belong here. And I tell them, if you don't leave now, then I will use my abilities to extract you. So there's things that you can do that this gets to be a bit technical for a podcast, but it could be the use of certain frequencies, such as tuning forks that repel them. It can be prayers where I bring in healing guides or angels, or I will call on higher dimensional shaman that have very high powers that will come support me in basically pushing them back to the astral dimension. There's other things you can do if you study the lore on the topic. One thing you can do is you can take salt and put a trail of salt around all the perimeter of the house. You can do it inside and out. Salt, are you aware that, for example, if you want to keep flies away, you can put these things that hang in your doorway and they reflect the light, and birds don't like them either. So like in our orchard, we hang these reflectors because it freaks the birds out. So the salt actually scatters light, and so it creates like a wall of light that entities have a very hard time passing through. So an ancient technique is to just like the Taoists do sand mandalas. You've ever seen the sand mandalas? So if you how when you make cakes, you can squeeze the icing through a tube with different sized nozzles, and you can make happy faces and draw things. If you get a funnel and fill it with ground salt, you can use the funnel like a pen, and you can circumscribe the whole house and leave a continuous bead of salt. And then the entities have a very hard time possessing the house. Garlic, raw garlic, has a very strong extraction effect on entities. They don't like it. When I've done some really intense work, I had a necklace of garlic cloves that I would wear to protect me. There's also things you can do, biogeometry. The biogeometry sells a CD you can play that produces frequencies that neutralize negative energies and bring up BG3, which is centering energy. It's healing energy, which is very repulsive to entities, and they don't like the frequencies of the biogeometry clearing audio. You can use an L90, which is a pendant that has a repelling energy on entities. So whenever people are susceptible to entity possession for any reason, I have them buy a biogeometry L90 pendant and wear it because it gives you sort of a blanket protection against negative entities and negative energies. Those are some of the common, simple things people can do.
In some ways, it seems almost like if you experience some type of entity or sensation in your home or your space, your task is to cultivate unconditional love, which is the scariest thing. It feels, or if that is the task, it feels like that's probably an appropriate response to most things.
I don't think it has to be unconditional, but you want to, the first thing the first thing to remember is that all entities at a spiritual level are some expression of yourself, because ultimately there's nothing here but God. So right now I'm just looking at the Aaron of myself, and you're looking at the Paul of yourself. But in order for God to experience love, it has to create the illusion of separation and individuality, or there's no way for there to be a lover and a beloved. But ultimately, what's looking through your eyes at me is exactly what's looking through my eyes at you. So when we reach the point of enough spiritual realization as to what really is going on here, then we have empathy and compassion for the people that are lost, scared, confused, and even people like Bill Gates, who is a real spiritual challenge for me because I know he's also God. But I have to confront that part of myself and figure out how to integrate that into myself without creating the illusion of the devil over there and creating separation, because then I'm buying into an illusion. So the point I'm making is that it's almost impossible for us to love unconditionally for many, many reasons that I go into in my more advanced training with my students in Spirit Gym and in the Chek Institute. We can hold the intention of giving unconditional love and we can project unconditional love out, but to love somebody else unconditionally is tricky because, like when mothers say, I love my children unconditionally, well, you already have broken the law of unconditional love because you're not loving everybody else's children that way. So you're creating a condition. So you've already left the law of unconditional love by saying my children, not yours. So a side note, aside from that, if we have empathy and compassion for the fact that these human entities are souls, almost all of which were traumatized and had challenging lives, and we approach them with love, respect, and reverence as though we were trying to help them, then we have a much better chance of helping them. A lot of them don't even know that they're dead, strangely enough. I've ran into many of them that actually, when I told them that they were dead, they had a hard time believing it because the shock of dying, like people, for example, that die in intense car accidents or bomb blasts or various other things, that they literally can be walking around on the earth plane wondering why nobody is talking to them, and like it's almost like they're still shell shocked, sort of, so to speak. But I've had to help people, and so has Angie, many times to realize that they'd lost their body. Because once you lose your physical body, you're in your astral body, and if you look at your astral body, it looks just like your physical body, except it's made of light. But because you're in the astral dimension, the density of the light creates the same relationship to your astral body that you have to your physical body. When you dream, you're in your astral body. And how real is that?
Well, this is something I've heard you mention, so where you got it from, but when a pickpocket sees a saint, he only sees a pocket. When a saint sees a pickpocket, he sees God.
Yes, and that's exactly it.
And what I was going to say is like the experience a person might have, and this, I don't know how accurate this would be, but an experience a person might have experiencing some type of energy or entity, it could create fear, it could create kind of chaos, it could draw up a lot of, internalized sensations. And it almost feels like love in a way, or a relationship. And if you can, with anyone, it doesn't need to be a romantic relationship, but particularly a romantic relationship might draw up a lot of sensations of fear, or it might draw up sensations of repressed stuff, childhood, anger, resentment, things of the sort. And the task in the situations is, are you able to see God within the pickpocket?
Exactly.
If you can do that, you become safe, you become a safe space, because you became a safe space for
Yeah.
yourself.
There can be negative entities that have malicious intention. Like I said, most of them have come because they are either addicts and need you to drink for them or drug for them, etc., or they want revenge. So if a person understands the kinds of things that I've shared and we've been talking about, one of the first things to do is pay close attention to what you feel inside if you're aware of or feel the presence of an entity. Like I said, if some big biker dude walked through your front door with tattoos all over and, gold and silver teeth and, um, you know, uh, what do you call those things? How they put metal through their body and their nose and their eyes, and you would know this guy is not here to help me clean the carpet, or pray with me. They're coming to take something. So, you have to be. It takes a fair bit of composure, because the shock most people experience when they encounter an entity puts them in a state of fear immediately, no matter, it could be Jesus coming in the house and they would be scared. Um, but what you got to do is you got to really calm and center yourself. Remember, they're in the astral dimension. They're not in the physical dimension. So if they're malicious, even if their intention is to hurt you, they can only act on you through the astral level of your being, although the astral pours down into the physical, which is why people get cravings for drugs and violence. But the point I'm making is, it's not like they can stab you with a knife and hurt you. To the degree that you realize what's happening and you center yourself in yourself, that act alone right there makes you quite a lot more safe. But then when you remember that most of these are traumatized people, and you approach them with the intention to, ask, what is it? Why are you here? What's going on? What do you need? You just have a conversation with them like you would with anybody that would need your help, or that you would be curious. I mean, it would be like if a vagrant set up a tent in your front yard and started camping and living there. I mean, most people, as soon as they saw that happening, would walk out and like, who are you? And what in the world are you doing? Putting a tent up in my yard, and inviting your friends over to smoke pot and drink and stay up all night.
If a person truly doesn't fear death or the transition of this body, what does that do to a person's life if they're actually come into a relationship of there's no resistance or contraction or pushing away or pulling or anything with the dynamic of transitioning out of the body? What happens?
Quite simply stated, they live fully. Fear of death stopping people from living tremendously. I mean, a huge percentage of the human population is radically holding back on living fully, exploring, and really stepping into the great opportunity of human existence, because of a perpetual fear of death or fear of injury or fear of lack of some kind. But, when a person's not afraid to die, the healthy aspect of it is you really engage life fully. The unhealthy aspect, which is usually in younger people, is you just do stupid things, and you're lucky if you survive yourself. Like young men do countless stupid things all the time, with cars, with drugs, with sex and every other thing they can get their hands on, because testosterone's a real hard chemical to manage for a young man. So those are the people I call young, dumb, and full of cum. Their biggest danger is to themselves. But the point is, a lot of them have the attitude of they don't think they can die. So they behave in ways that are not spiritual, but reflect the attitude of I can't die. But usually after a couple of broken bones or a concussion or two, they start waking up to the reality that they're in a physical body and has certain requirements, and that the angel of death can get dangerously close, especially to stupidity.
I've heard you say all addictions are attempts to get safe love.
Yeah. First of all, I define an addiction as any repeated behavior that does not produce the results you want. Any repeated behavior that does not produce the results you want. So you can be addicted to almost anything, and addictions are probably the most common thing I have to deal with clinically, because they're behind most people's health problems. But actually, in my experience of working with so many addicts, I've identified that almost all their addictions are attempts to get safe love. The number of people that have very traumatic childhoods at the base of their health problems and relationship problems is uncountably high. And so addictions, for example, no beer bottle ever complains whether or not you're a good enough kisser. Neither does a cigarette. But you could have gotten wounded because early in your life you kissed the opposite sex and they told you were a lousy kisser, and it just kind of broke your heart, and you haven't recovered from that. And now you're afraid to kiss people, for example, because you're worried about getting criticized. If people have been physically, emotionally, mentally, or sexually abused, then until they heal that, there's a lot of fear in them. And that fear stops them from feeling love through connection because they're afraid that the connection is going to lead to more pain. So heroin and alcohol and many drugs actually numb the pain that for the first time allows them to have a sense of freedom. If you translate that, allows them to feel connection, which is what love is. I define love as the flow of energy and information through empathic and compassionate connection to oneself or another, any other. So you can love a person, a place, or a thing, but there's a flow of energy or you wouldn't feel it. There's information. We all know there's a difference in what it means when someone says, I love you, from sarcasm to deep commitment. So there's the flow of energy and information through empathic, I feel, and compassionate, I understand, connection to self or other. So if a person can't get a sense of empathy and compassion and connection from another, then they will get it through whatever means they can, whether that means being a workaholic and loving your work, or being an addicted athlete, or addicted to alcohol, to drugs, to sex, whatever it is.
I've heard you also say something along the lines of unconditional love, or maybe perhaps just opening ourselves to love, whatever kind of semantics words, can be scary because it will dissolve the ego. And if you really truly open yourself up to that, you'll have to allow the story, the architecture of the stories that you hold with yourself to begin to dissolve, or at least be open to that. But I feel like it's a lot of this is tied to this fear that we hold, a fear of death. And I've heard I was listening to a thing with Ram Dass, and there was someone was asking him a question, and they were asking around like the fear, and they said something along the lines of, it almost feels like it's like we have fear of the fear of the fear of the fear, and we play, and the fear can squirt out in different ways. Oh, I'm afraid of, financial stuff. I'm afraid of safety. Oh, I'm afraid of relationship stuff. I'm afraid we get hurt. Is there something beneath the symptomology of fear that's like there's actually a core thread of fear that humanity holds? Am I getting too deep with that question? Is that
No. If you read the book It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wu Lin, who is an expert on ancestral trauma and ancestral healing, one of the questions he teaches you to ask to identify what somebody's core wound is what is your greatest fear? And the process you go through is, if I said, Aaron, what is your greatest fear? And it's fear that I might not be successful. then I would say, what is your greatest fear of not being successful? That I might not feel like my life is meaning or of value. What is your greatest fear of not feeling a life of meaning and value? So you keep going that till you get to the reductio ad absurdum, the absolute core fear. And that's where, as a therapist, I have to start doing on the healing, because if I work at any of the higher levels of fear, it's like topping a weed, it'll just grow back, because it's a knock-on effect of a deeper fear. So my work as a therapist is to get to the core fear. For most people, it's fear of death. And then I ask them, what is your fear of death? And it can be a variety of answers. And kind of a paradoxical thing that comes to my mind, because of my level of awareness, when my children came in, I have a 45-year-old son. I wasn't quite so awake when he came into the world because I was only 18. But when Mana came in, I was 54, and Zoe came 3 years later at 57. So I had developed myself and my abilities quite a lot. And I also had studied childhood development and a lot of Steiner's teachings on how the soul incarnates and all the relevant things. So one of the questions I asked my kids is, and Mana gave the answer I'm going to give you now. Once Mana could carry a conversation, I said to him, do you remember what you were doing before you came into Mommy's womb? He said, yes. I said, what were you doing? He said, I was wandering around the universe all by myself, looking for a family. I was alone. And then he said, spontaneously, about 1 or 2 seconds, he paused, and then he said, oh, actually, I wasn't alone. I was with Zoe. And I said, well, what were you guys doing? He said, we were looking for a family. But then he started laughing. He says, but I got to Mommy first. Zoe had to wait.
How old is he at this point that he's saying this?
He was, I think, 4, and Zoe came 3 years after him. And so, then I asked him, well, why did you choose us and things like that? But both of them said the same thing. They said, we both have been watching the world and we see there's real problems, but we both have skill sets that are going to be needed for the transition the world's now entering into. And you and Penny and Mommy have the knowledge that will activate our past life knowledge to remind us of why we're here. So we specifically chose you to awaken us to who we are and why we're here.
Okay. What would you say your suggestion for a parent to foster a child into this soul, into this world, and not contaminate them with too much adulthood at a young age?
Well, the biggest fear any foster child has is the issue of abandonment. It's a very deep wound.
Oh, I don't mean foster child. I just mean foster them into the world, like any child.
Oh, any child, like
like how do I foster this soul into the world and not contaminate them with too much of me or too much of, just like I talked the author Neil Strauss. He has a son, and that was one of the things that he suggested to me in a conversation, was like that thing that's the most boggling for him is like, how do I maintain that imagination and the dream and the wisdom, like he holds this wisdom now. How do I not contaminate that and pollute that, but keep that safe and cultivate that for him?
Yeah, I understand the question. Steiner, for example, warns that most parents should not play with their children until they learn how to play, because they are so judgmental that it actually stops the child from enjoying playing and can be very disruptive to its childhood. He says that parents need to go learn to play like children by being around children and learning to emulate children. But they have this terrible tendency of, because children are so in the astral dimension and so in their right brain, because the right brain is the main mode of brain function, and there's a progression toward left brain starting at about 4 years, progressing through 12 years and beyond, which is why Steiner doesn't like teaching children how to read or giving them mathematics before age 7 to 10, depending on the developmental rate of the child, because it pushes them into their left brain and they lose touch with wholeness. And so you get what we have in the world today is, people that can fly airplanes but don't know how to eat or have a relationship.
In a relationship, yeah.
And this is also a huge danger with social media. But so step one is learn to play without attachment to outcomes, just simply to play. The next thing is the biggest misconception that parents make is that child is their possession. You're my child, and I'm going to shape you into what I want you to be. You're going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is. And so they forget that that is not their child. It was their spiritual obligation to give the child a body, but it's a very unique soul that comes in with its own guiding intelligence and its own soul contracts to fulfill and its own lessons to learn and its own gifts to bring to the world. And so the most important thing a parent can do is to clean, feed, nurture, and protect, but not to coerce or force the child to do or be. And this includes religion. Parents have a terrible habit of imposing religious ideals on people. And I've had to work with a number of sick children over the years because the parents were at their wits' end as to what to do. Often it starts in school with learning disorders and an inability to learn and angry outbursts and things that get kids put on psychotropic drugs by psychologists and psychiatrists. But if the parent realizes this soul is a very unique being that's come to them to get indoctrinated into the time, place, and culture it's in so that it can carry out its own soul path, and we give the child exposure to as much as we can in its childhood, be it music, musical instruments, sports, books, toys. We have to let the child find itself. And they all, Arnold Mandel, famous psychologist, Jungian analyst, mathematician, expert in quantum physics, a genius who recently died, unfortunately, wrote many excellent books. He did research and showed that 70% of people became exactly what they dreamed they would be between ages 5 and 7. So if you go to a little boy who's 5 to 7 and say, what are you going to be when you grow up? And he says a policeman or a fireman or a doctor or a forest ranger, 70% of the people surveyed in large surveys actually became exactly what their childhood dream was, because the soul's already awake to why it's here. It just gets reminded of that by exposure to the right environment, such as seeing a fire truck, like we've taken the kids many times to the fire station, so they could all of a sudden realize I'm a fireman, and their whole life on the inside now becomes oriented to, directed to, and interested in everything to do with being a fireman. But when parents try to coerce the child into something else, it becomes extremely stressful. And it's actually quite dangerous, and Jung describes this very thoroughly in his writings, and that is something paradoxical can happen. If the child feels so stifled at the soul level that it can't do what it came to do. For example, if you have a kid who's naturally inclined to music and being a musician, but the parents keep telling it, quit goofing around on the piano all the time or the drum set or whatever, you need to study and, you need to become a doctor or an accountant or a lawyer or something respectable. The child's soul can actually get so much what we would call developmental stress that the soul actually can revert in polarity. So the daemon, the guiding genius, can become demonic to the degree that the heart of the child cannot be fulfilled. It can develop so much resent for its own parents, its own life, and even teachers that it feels like are forcing it to do things, that the polarity of love reverses and now it becomes rebellious. And so you can now have children that get into drugs really early. They need a way to escape the pain, or they start being violent. they do anything they can to demonstrate to the parents that they're not happy with their life and that they need help. I found this to be a very common thing of the children that I've had to help, because the parents hired me to help them with children that were being indoctrinated in Christian churches and were sent to things like Catholic schools, where they were getting all this hard rules and scary stuff about God and punishment, because the soul had already evolved beyond that level of development. And it was extremely suffocating for the soul, and the soul felt like it was moving in the wrong direction. And in every single case, I was able to encourage the parents to put the child in a Waldorf school, and every time they did, the child began to blossom, and the behavioral disorders and health problem cleared up. Or get them into self-realization fellowship under Yogananda's teaching, which is another very Unitarian path that's open to all faiths and philosophies without judgment, or Baha'i, or things like that that are universal but not constricted to a belief system of any one type. So the point is, parents have to be very, very careful about imposing their ideology onto a child at the expense of suffocating that soul, and that basically can lead that soul into a really hard period, which they may not be fortunate to come out of, because if they get caught in drug addictions and violence, they can end up in prisons and gangs. And I think that's one of the reasons we have so many problems with gangs, and so many people in prisons, and so many people that are anxious and depressed and suicidal. I mean, I'm sure you know right now the statistics of anxiety, depression, and suicide are at the highest levels they've ever been in recorded history in all age groups. And I think it's because there's so much existential angst in the world right now, with things that really, COVID was the kind of the big bomb to the culture, and to the family unit, and to the soul, and to a sense of meaning. So now we have a tremendous problem with existential angst, and the children are feeling lost and hopeless. And one of the most dangerous things for a child is having parents that don't have any clear sense of direction in their life. That's very scary for a child. Like if mom and dad are fighting all the time and constantly bitching because they don't have enough money, and a lot of angry emotions, then the children, they feel confused, and they don't know what to do to help. So ultimately, the children inadvertently end up feeling it's their job to try to heal and help their parents, but children shouldn't be taking on those kinds of responsibilities, because it knocks them completely out of childhood, but it also leaves them feeling guilty and shameful because they don't really know how to rationalize what's happening, so they embody it as though it was their fault. And that's very traumatic to a child. It's more weight than a child can usually hold, which is one of the reasons we have so much anxiety, depression, and suicide and disease amongst children, as well as other factors such as bad diet and environment and lifestyle. But you mix all those together, you got one hell of a melting pot for the destruction of a child's life.
Thank you so much for making time to do this. I want to ask you one final kind of closing thing. I'd love to keep on talking for another hour, but if there was the biggest lie from your perception that modern people might be convinced by, that if they released that lie that they tell themselves, might open them up to a deeper sense of ease or liberation or freedom or grace or love in their life, is there any standout lie that people are telling themselves with regularity?
Yes. And it's not their fault. It's the product of religious programming, and that is that God is out there, and that we're fallen, and that we're sinners, and that we're being punished, and that you have to go through another medium such as a church or Jesus or somebody else to get to God. And so what happens is people live their life always trying to figure out how to be lovable enough to get God's approval, which makes them very afraid of death and God. But in actuality, all creation from every aspect of the universe, the multiverse, or whatever dimension you want to speak about it, is God embodied. God is the earth, the water, the fire, the air, the birds, the bees, the flowers, the trees, the human beings. There is nothing that is not God. By definition, God is prime source. Anything that is in creation is an expression of the divine dreaming itself into existence for its own self-realization, its own awakening, and its own experience. And even though God is said to be omniscient, all-knowing, people forget that there's a difference between knowing and experiencing. God can't know its own perfection until it tests it. We can't have wisdom without the actual process of life and learning and growing and having the challenges and trials that ultimately produce wisdom. So God actually dreams itself into existence, falls asleep in the dream, and we and all living beings are God embodied, going through the process of getting experience so that its knowing can be verified through experience. So one of the biggest story that people tell themselves is that God's out there and they're always trying to be good enough and petitioning with God for acceptance. But in reality, God is the only source of a soul, and all souls are inherently God's unconditional love on a journey of self-realization and self-expression. And each soul brings something unique to the world, and only that soul can give the world. And if we realize that there's nothing here but God, and we realize that the best way to love God is the way we would love to be loved, and that means taking care of the environment. It means taking care of each other and having morals and ethics that are universally applicable, which is why the Golden Rule is probably what should have been written 1,000 pages over in the Bible, instead of all the confusion and things that make so much religious text so challenging for people to understand and abide by. I mean, that's why there's 45,000 branches of Christianity. The Bible's confusing enough to lead to mass confusion. And so if we really realize that doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, that's the golden rule. Then the silver rule, as I learned from Annie, I can't remember Annie's name. She wrote a book called Healing with Haiku. She created the silver rule: do to yourself as you would have others do to you, meaning you have to love yourself first, or you won't know how to love others. So the gold and the silver rule really are the truth about God. If you understand what God is, then treat everybody as though they're an expression of the divine, and they naturally will treat you in a way that is reciprocal to the way you've treated them. So I think if people can just ask some honest questions, how did all this get here? How did I get here? Who am I and what am I? And keep tracking it back, just like I said you do with your fears. I'm afraid of this. Well, what would happen if that happened? Why is that so fearful? If you say, where did this come from? Where did that come from? Well, you get to an impasse, and we use the word God as a placeholder for the mystery from which it all emerges. And we are all living in, as, and through the mystery that is God itself. But God has no name or no face except yours and mine and everybody else's.
Which I think that is, that doesn't conflict with Christ, what you're saying. From my perspective, I believe like Christ consciousness, to me, it feels like coming into what you're saying, coming into seeing, compassion and empathy for all things.
Yes, the key distinction there is Jesus is a story about a man, which is an allegorical teaching story and is a parallel to many myths. For example, if you read the book, The World's 16 Crucified Saviors by Kersey Graves, he shows you there's been 16 saviors that have come, died, resurrected in 3 days, etc. And that it's not by any means something Jesus was select. If you look, for example, Kersey Graves points out that a direct analysis of the myth of Krishna, which is much older than the myth of Jesus, there is 369 direct parallels between the story of Jesus and the story of Krishna, which means it's really almost a carbon copy with names and things changed. If you read the book Christianity Before Christ, the author shows you through analysis of many older myths that have repeated themselves throughout antiquity that the story of Jesus is a repeat of many of the most successful myths in the world, and religions have capitalized on that. So by definition, the word Christ, as it is applied to Jesus, is a title. It is not a name, and it means one who is united with the all. It means one who is in a state of unconditional love. So the Christ is, as you said, Christ consciousness, and the way we reincarnate Christ is to live from the heart and ask ourselves in challenging situations, what would love do now? And do our best to use our heart to feel what we know, not our judging mind. And that is the journey from the head to the heart, which may take 1,000 lifetimes for some people, and it might take one. But to be Christ-like means to live from your heart and recognize that everything here is God and everyone here is God. So act that way. And this is why I love the first principle of Sufism, by the way. The first principle of Sufism is there is no God but God. I worship everything and everyone. And to me, that is a very awakened statement.
Yeah. And religious tribalism is ironic because it perpetuates division, which is the opposite of Christ consciousness perspective. So I don't think that it like having perspectives like this goes against many belief systems. It's just the perversions that arose from people atop of the belief system.
Mostly people that want to commandeer the belief system to take advantage of people, and that goes on for as long as human beings have been alive. That's really one of the challenges with religion. Personally, I have no problem with religion because it's got a very important function. I have a real problem with the co-opting of religion and the corporatizing of religion for money, power, and control, because now it is no different than brainwashing. And unfortunately, that's what's infected the planet. And people like Walter Russell and Rudolf Steiner and many others give very clear descriptions of exactly how that's been done. When you hang your hat on the Jesus story, then you're hanging your hat on a myth. When you put your investment in Christ, you're putting your investment in something that is universal and applicable to all people in all places and all times. The Jesus story divides. The Christ consciousness integrates and unifies. So that's how I handle that, because religion is at the root of more of my patients' illnesses and diseases than anything at all.
Yeah. And my belief, and then we'll wrap up because you gotta go, but my belief is to kind of summate the whole thing, everything we were talking about before of fractured psyches and the mirror having a fracture and, there being a dark spot, which opens you up to entities, whether if that's too far out for someone to believe, you could think of that as like metaphoric or literal, depending upon your perspective on things. But that could be toxic people coming into your life, parasitic people coming into your life, parasitic activities that you end up choosing, becoming obese, living in anxiety, living in fear, living in, all of those things. A path towards that unitive, Christ consciousness, it seems to me, is the solution in that. That doesn't need to be called any religion. It's just the path.
No, it can be called Buddha consciousness. It can be Tao consciousness. They're all the same. They're just different names for the same thing. It's for Christians, it's very important to remember Isaiah 45:7, which is so truthful that about 25 or more years ago, the Christians begin changing that so it doesn't read the same. So in some Bibles, it won't say what I'm about to tell you, but I have a collection of a good 12 or 15 different Bibles from different periods, different countries, and different styles, so I can compare them. But if you look at the King James Version, Isaiah 45:7 says, I, the Lord, create the light and dark, good and evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. And the Christians hate that so much they changed it while telling everybody the Bible's the inspired word of God and never been changed, which is just silliness. But the point is that God cannot become conscious, know itself, or be conscious of an experience or its own growth and its own awakening and awareness to itself, because God, being unconditional, isn't conscious. That's why God dreams. God doesn't think. God thinks only after we have characters in the dream that can exchange energy and information between 2 points of sentience, which is the prerequisite of a mind. So the point that I'm bringing up here, I create the light and the dark, good and evil. Those are the two polarities that you have to have consciousness. You can't know what north is without south, male without female, up without down, inside without outside. And God can't know itself as only the good, and the good means nothing without bad or evil. So essentially, evil paradoxically upholds the good. It points to it so we know what it is and what it isn't. Evil is really the absence of love. Good is that which is good for everybody, which would be, as archetypally, good, beauty, truth, and love are that which is good for everybody. But you can't have truth without not truth, good without not good, love without not love. And so that creates a field of tension in which mind is able to make distinctions and discernments. And this is why the famous Jungian analyst and psychiatrist Edward Edinger said, consciousness is a psychic substance produced not blindly, but in living awareness of opposites. Point being, God has to enter into both of its polarities. It has to allow us the choice not to love so that we can love out of free will, or love is not authentic. You might as well be a blow-up doll or a robotic lover. Without good and evil, we could not have free will, and therefore we wouldn't really be alive or human. We would just be robots of some kind. And God itself can't know itself without exploring all of its potentials. So what we call evil is really God exploring the negative polarity of itself, and what we call love, good, beauty, and truth is God experiencing the positive polarity of itself. But those have to happen simultaneously, or God itself cannot make meaning. And if there's no capacity for meaning making, there's nothing for spirit to flow into. All you got to do is look at any time in your life you were doing something you thought was meaningful or meaningless, and you had no esprit de corps, no willingness to do a good job. It was more like an illness that you couldn't wait to get rid of. So because the function of God's dreaming in life is meaning making, so that God can evaluate its infinite potentials against reality to see what's ultimately true, we have to actually understand the function of these polarities and how consciousness is created and evolves. Or we can fall into a negative relationship with God and religion, because we can easily fall into the trap of saying, well, if God is love and God is God, then why all the evil in the world? But if we realize that without the choice to not love, we have no free will and we have no choice to love. And therefore, we realize that that is the matrix within which consciousness is created and evolves. And without consciousness, then God has no way of knowing it is God. Because at the highest level, God is unconditional, so there's nothing to know or be there. And that is classically referred to as non-being. So if you study the metaphysical architecture of creation, above being, you have non-being. And this is why Arthur M. Young says, non-being is significant because it is aware of being. Being is all that is created in the matrix, created by the tension between good and evil, right and wrong, material, immaterial, etc. But that which is aware and paradoxically in but not in, which is paradox that only God can do, is what is aware of everything happening inside of itself, like you're aware when you've got to go to the toilet or you've got a gas pain or you're hungry. But it is, God is aware but capable of being outside of it, just like you can meditate and watch yourself thinking, but simultaneously pouring itself into it, which once again is such a paradox that most people haven't got the psychological maturation to deal with paradoxes, which is why we fall into the trap of believing highly polarized myths and thinking that it's the truth and being willing to kill others over it, which just shows a lack of conscious evolution in people like that.
And the things that we are the most triggered by or charged by or have the most hatred towards or resistance towards would typically, I would presume, be breadcrumbs towards where we're stuck.
Yes, yeah. Like attracts like and opposites attract. So to the degree you have a negative reaction to or an aversion to, it's almost always something within yourself that you don't want to look at, and that's how the shadow is made. So whatever you don't want to acknowledge as a quality within yourself, you have to create a scapegoat for, and that's what projection is. So if you're mad at your wife, but you don't want to tell her because she'll stop cooking for you, then you kick your dog. So the dog becomes the scapegoat for your anger towards your wife and your inability to convert that anger into understanding, empathy, and compassion for why your breakfast is late, as a metaphor.
But if you can tap into Christ consciousness or Buddha consciousness or whatever, you develop compassion for your wife and for yourself for developing that sensation in that moment. And you can start to kind of heal.
You can transcend the polarity. You can rise above the polarity.
And then in that state, you become kind of like Christ consciousness and you become like a healing vehicle for the planet.
Yeah, you become more, the more you do that, the more Christ-like you become, the more unified you become, the more integrated you become, the more whole you become. And really you can see where a person's at in their spiritual evolution. Simply put, as I teach in Spirit Gym, people at the beginning of their evolution are I-centric. All religions that are I-centric have it my religion against your religion. Ethnocentric religion comes from we-centric love. We love Christians, but we don't love anybody else. I love my family, but I don't love you. I love my children, but not yours. So we grow in consciousness and love from I-centric to we-centric to all-centric, where we realize all of us are expressions of the divine and that all scriptures are actually intended to help people navigate, undulations of life, and that we're all one and that we're all here to, love and live and create together to fully embody the truth of who and what we really are, which is what prophets and great avatars and people like Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha and Krishna and Lao Tzu, these are all just examples of highly evolved beings that incarnate to show us what it looks like to be at the level of living as unconditionally loving as possible, which is exactly why Jesus said, if your enemy hits you in the face, turn the other cheek. Love your enemy as yourself. Well, I've met 0 Christians yet that can do that. But I've met many that will kill you or accuse you or criticize you or ridicule you because you're of a different faith and haven't taken Jesus as your savior and things like that. And this is unfortunately rampant in most religions. So it's not just Christianity, it's just the state of human beings. And I'll close by saying we must remember the world is a schoolyard for souls that are about 3rd grade level of evolution. So the world's always kind of full of these kind of paradoxes and crazy traumatic experiences because most of the souls here are still very unevolved, with the occasional soul that comes to the world like a school teacher or a guide. So you get every now and then an Eckhart Tolle pops out of the park and says, here I am. Or, a Yogananda or a Ibn al-Arabi or, Meister Eckhart or Saint Hildegard of Bingen or Father Thomas Keating or, people like that. They come back to school to guide and to help organize us so that we don't get too lost in our own mythology.
Yeah. And those prophets usually don't take themselves too seriously, I don't think.
Well, they know who and what they are, so they paradoxically do both. They take it seriously because they know they're emissaries of God, and that they're here to help God wake up. but they don't take it seriously because they know the worst thing that'll happen is you die, and you'll always know the truth when you die, and that you can't really die. So it's all, that's why we have the concept of Maya, the grand illusion. Arthur M. Young warns, though, don't think it's the illusion like an illusion, like a video game. It is the illusion. It's the only way God can know itself and experience itself. So paradoxically, it's an illusion, but it is the illusion, and it is the dream of life itself.
Thanks so much, man.
Yep, my pleasure.
Yeah. People, to go deeper into your work beyond this, where could people go from here?
Those that want to learn more about my holistic approach to spiritual development are welcome to check out my Spirit Gem. I have a free Spirit Gem mini course that they can sign up for at myspiritgem.com/mini course. You can get 15% off any of my levels of Spirit Gem membership at myspiritgem.com if they use the promo code ALIGN15. You can learn a lot more about me in general at paulchek.com, where it's kind of a hub for all of my work. And then you can see the website for my Institute for Holistic Health at chekinstitute.com. And my Spirit Gem podcast is on any of the major channels, but you can also see it at paulchek.com/podcast, which is on all the major outlets. And then I have a YouTube channel with something like 1,300 videos I've done for healing for the public on almost everything from exercise to you name it. And that's youtube.com/Paul, CHEK Live, Paul Chek Live. Instagram is at paul.chek. And, all the other ones, TikTok, Twitter, they're all either at paul.chek or Twitter's at Paul Chek. Facebook, Paul Chek, SPAGE. I'm not sure. I don't use those. Penny gives me this list, but it's not hard to.
I figured.
they're not. I'm not hard to find. I mean, you can type my name in any search engine, but paulchek.com is sort of the hub. So if you want to see what's available through my life's work, then paulchek.com is kind of an axle around which all these other sites turn, and there's tabs to go to each of them, and the podcast is there, and the Spirit Gem program, which is my magnum opus. It's 15-volume book series synthesized down into 75 video lessons for over 80 hours of training, and a community forum where I give lessons each week. And there's a podcast membership as well with a forum. So spiritgem.com is really where I would encourage people to go if they want to join me in a quest for their own healing and spiritual growth and development through a sort of it's not a religious approach. It's really a meta myth approach where you can put any story in, and I just show you how to work with that story to create what you really want and identify what you came here to do as a soul and how to do that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in. That was it. As all. We'll see you next week. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed that episode, you might also enjoy this episode over here, as well as this one over here. Thank you for subscribing. Appreciate you. I'll see you in the next video.